Welcome to this training on how to report your activities funded by the Violence Against Women Act. This training is presented by the Violence Against Women Act Measuring Effectiveness Initiative, or VAWA-MEI, at the Muskie School of Public Service, which is a national technical assistance provider for grantees and is also responsible for analyzing grantee-reported data for the Office on Violence Against Women, or OVW. This training is for grantees with a culturally specific services grant or an underserved grant. Those would be the grant to enhance culturally specific services for victims of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking, which we will refer to as the CISP grant, or the Outreach and Services for Underserved Populations grant program, which we will refer to as the Underserved grant program. Grantees are required to report on their funded activities every 6 months using the semi-annual progress reporting form, which they submit into GMS, or the Grants Management System. These reports cover reporting periods that span from January to June and July to December. Each progress report is due 1 month after the close of the reporting period. So for the period of January through June, your report is due on July 30th. For the period of July through December, your report is due on January 30th. First of all, I want to thank you for accessing this training. We hope that this training enables you to provide the most detailed and accurate reporting of your grant-funded work on your semi-annual progress reports. Accurate data reporting is so important for many reasons. Your quantitative and qualitative data enables VAWA's effectiveness to be measured. VAWA-MEI creates reports for OVW using your data and data from grantees all across the country. These summary data reports support OVW to make requests for increased appropriations and to defend VAWA's budget to decision makers. Your data also helps OVW to make sure that federal funds are being spent appropriately and to measure the performance of grant programs. Additionally, every 2 years, the Attorney General is required to submit a report to Congress on the overall effectiveness of VAWA funding. VAWA grantee data makes up a significant part of that mandated report. So the more consistently that grantees fill out these progress reports, the more accurately VAWA's effectiveness can be measured through these means. Before we get started with this training, I want to draw your attention to the split screen. On the right-hand side, we have the progress reporting form. This is the form that is used for both CISP grantees and underserved grantees. As we go through the training, I'm going to scroll through the progress report, and we're going to go question by question and talk about how to report. On the left-hand side of your screen, you have informational slides. Now, before we begin, I want to let you know that you can download the separate instructions from our website, and these will be really helpful as you go through your reporting form. They go question by question through the form, and they are extremely helpful. Secondly, there are other categories listed for many questions throughout the report. In general, we ask that you use the other category only if you can't find another category that already exists and is a close fit for the information that you are trying to report. When we aggregate data for reports, often the responses that are in the other category do not get included in the totals. So we realize that there are instances where you need to use that other category because your data simply doesn't fit in the existing categories and there's not a close fit. That's fine. We just ask that you be specific and take the time to rule out all of the other options first. Additionally, if you don't need to use the other box, then you can just leave it blank. Please don't put things like NA, not applicable, not yet, etc. Next, you will also find optional narrative questions at the end of each section in the report. Use those sections to talk about the unique successes of your grant-funded activities. Talk about the impact that grant-funded activities have on your community and for survivors. These questions exist at the end of each section so that you can provide more detail about the work being done in each area, and you can tell us a story behind the data, which is really helpful for us to understand your data and for policymakers to be moved by it. We encourage that you report in the optional narrative questions so that we can get a bigger picture and more accurate idea of what's going on with your program funds. We also ask that you try not to use acronyms and abbreviations since we don't know what your acronyms and abbreviations stand for at your agencies. If you do need to use an acronym or an abbreviation, please spell it out for us each time you use it. Finally, please do not attach any extra documents, as these will never come to us at VAWA MEI. Only the data that is reported in the form itself will come to us for analysis. So please do not use other attachments or documents if you want that data to come to us to help us understand what it is on the form. And lastly, I just want to encourage you to call us or email us. We are technical assistance providers, and we're here to help you in your reporting of your funded activities on this form. So please don't hesitate to reach out. First, we're going to get started with the beginning of the form, the general grant information. The first question is the date that you're submitting this report. Second question is the reporting period, so that's January through June or July through December, and then the year. Your grantee name and number, questions 3 and 4, should come pre-populated. If they're not correct, then you should contact GMS to make sure that you have the correct reporting form. Question 5 asks for what kind of agency or organization you are and whether or not it is a faith-based organization or if it is partnered with a faith-based organization. Question 6 asks for a point of contact, and for this you want to keep in mind this is the person that is most familiar with the day-to-day activities of your grant-funded work. And this is also the person that we will contact if we have any questions about the data that you report. In question 7, the form asks whether your grant funds are specifically used to address or serve tribal populations. If yes, please be very specific and list out all of the tribes or nations that you are serving. Question 8 asks for the culturally and linguistically specific populations that you are serving, and you can check all that apply. Question 8 simply asks for additional information. You can tell us more about your organization if you would like. Question 9 asks what percentage of your culturally and linguistically specific services program funds are directed to each of these areas: sexual assault, domestic violence and dating violence, and stalking. This you can answer at your discretion. It is an estimate as to how much staff time and how many resources are being devoted to each of these areas of victimization and addressing them. Question 10 asks for the percentage of your grant funds that are being used for prevention activities. And again, this is an estimate, but use your discretion to estimate like how many of your resources are being devoted to prevention activities. In question 11, we would like to know how many of your funds are being used for providing culturally specific services for children that are exposed to violence. And again, that is an estimate where you're telling us how many of your resources are being devoted to children exposed to violence. I'm going to move us along to the staff section. So when you are considering how to report in the staff section, the most important thing is to remember that this form is about capturing what your grant dollars are being used to fund. So we are only capturing grant-funded staff, and that may be the salaries that are wholly or partially funded by grant dollars, and it may be consultants and contractors who are paid, their invoices are paid with grant funds, but we are only capturing who is grant-funded and what percentage of their time is grant-funded. We report in terms of full-time equivalents, or FTEs. FTEs are in decimals, not percentages, but it's capturing how much of somebody's time is being paid by this grant. We realize that many people working in your organizations wear multiple hats. And so if you are doing more than one function, we ask that you break apart your FTE by function rather than just telling us your job title. Your job title will not be as descriptive as the functions that you are doing, and we try to get the most specific, accurate picture of what grant dollars are funding at your organization. So if you are doing more than one job with one title, please remember to divide your FTE into the appropriate categories in question 12. Time should be prorated if necessary. This might be necessary when somebody is part-time or they are hired partway through the grant period and so they haven't worked for the full 6-month period, or if it's a contractor or consultant, or if it's somebody is full-time but only partially funded under the SIP or Underserved program grant. There's also an other category in the staff section, and we ask you to only use that if absolutely necessary and there's not a close fit category. And if you do need to use that other category, then please tell us the FTE associated with each job description that you put in that other category. Here's a cheat sheet to help us calculate FTEs, and we're going to go through this because it can be tricky. When we're calculating FTEs, and remember these are not percentages, these are decimals, we're using this number 1,040 as our guiding star. This is the number of working hours in a 6-month reporting period. If somebody is working 40 hours a week for 26 weeks out of the year, that's 6 months, then they have worked 1,040 hours. So we use that number as our denominator when we're calculating how much somebody's time is devoted to this grant. So if somebody is working full-time and they are fully funded under the grant, then they've worked the 1,040 hours, they're 1 FTE. If somebody is working part-time, 20 hours a week, and they are fully funded by the grant, that's 0.5 FTE, not 50%, but 0.5 FTE. And this will also help you calculate somebody who is not a regular employee but maybe is doing contracted work and they have billed you for a certain number of hours during the reporting period. You calculate how many hours they have billed you for, you take that number of hours and divide it by 1,040, and that will give you their FTE. For example, if somebody has billed you for 104 hours during the 6 months, you divide that by 1,040, and that will give you 0.10, and that is the FTE you want to use. We're going to go through the example on the form to our right. So first, your organization is staffing one full-time outreach worker whose salary is 35% funded by the SISP or Underserved grant that you have, and another full-time outreach worker whose salary is 50% funded by the grant. So because we are only capturing what is funded by the grant on this form, we are going to report only the percentage of that salary that was grant funded. So we're going to take the 35% and the 50% and add them together. 0.35 plus 0.50 comes out to 0.85. We add those together for outreach worker, and the FTE that we put in the category is 0.85. Next, your organization is also staffing a full-time employee who spent 16 hours a week coordinating the program and 24 hours a week training professionals in the field and holding community education events. So, because this person is doing more than one job, they have 2 functions but 1 job description or 1 title, we're going to break it apart by how much of their time is doing each function. So 40% of the time, or 16 hours a week, they're doing program coordination. So we're going to take that 0.40, which is 16 divided by 4, and that 24 hours, which is 60%, 0.60, and we're going to put these in each category. So 0.4 FTE, program coordinator, and 0.60 FTE, educator or trainer. So those are the FTEs that are associated with this one staff person doing 2 functions. Next, this organization is funding a full-time victim advocate who was hired 3 months into the reporting period. So in this case, we need to prorate because they are only working for half of the reporting period, 3 months out of 6 months, but they are full-time and fully funded. That drops them down to 0.5 FTE. And maybe next period, when this person has been working the whole 6 months, then they become 1 full FTE, assuming they are still fully funded and full-time. But this time, fully funded and full-time with only 3 months under their belt, that's 0.5 FTE. So that is an example of prorating. And the form will automatically total your staff to 2.35 FTE, but we can see in question 12 that it's broken apart by category, and the total is 2.35. Now we're going to look at purpose areas in section B. You should check all of the purpose areas that apply to the activities that you're engaging in with your SISP or Underserved grant during this reporting period. If you're not sure what your purpose areas are, then you can refer to your grant proposal, your award letter. And if your purpose areas have changed, then you may need to check in with your program specialist at OVW to make sure that those changes are approved before you check the boxes associated with those in question 13. The next section is training. So if you are using SISP or underserved funds to support training activities, then you're going to check yes at the top of this page. And in question 15, you're going to tell us how many events were funded. Now, keep in mind when you think about training, that training is defined as activities for professionals or volunteers acting in the role of a professional to improve their response to victims and survivors as it relates to their role in the system. So this is not staff development, and it is also not community education, which would be for a general audience. So when you're thinking about whether or not this is training or education or staff development, you're really thinking about your audience. Your audience is not funded by your grant. The event is supported by your grant, but this is not grant-funded staff attending the training. And it's also not the general public attending the training, because the general public isn't generally acting in the role of a professional as it relates to their response to victims and survivors and their role in the system. So one key to remember when you are providing training events is to keep sign-in sheets. That will help you to figure out whether this is a training thing or an education thing, first of all, but it will also help you to report accurately in questions 15 and 16, because it's going to ask for the attendees of these training events by profession. Turning to our example, your grant funds are supporting 10 training events for professionals this reporting period. 3 training events provided by other funds also took place. In these training events, 210 professionals attended the grant-funded training events. 45 professionals attended the trainings that were provided under other funding streams. So, remembering that we are only capturing on this form what was grant-funded, we're only going to take into account those 10 events that are funded by this grant program. So we put 10 in question 15 for how many events were provided. Next, in question 16, we're going to break apart our attendees by profession. That's where your sign-in sheets come in really handy. And so we're going to list out all of the people that attended, all 210, and the form will total these at the bottom. In question 17, you want to check all of the appropriate boxes next to the topic areas that were covered at these grant-funded trainings. In question 18, you can provide more information about the training activities that you're doing with grant funds. Moving on to community education. Education is defined as the dissemination of general information that may increase public awareness of sexual assault, domestic violence, dating violence, and stalking. So again, it really comes down to your audience. Education is about the general public. Training is about professionals. So turning to our example, grant funds were used to support 10 community events and 8 school presentations. 1,150 various community members were reached at the community events, and 620 students and educators were reached through the school presentations. So to report this on the form, in question 19, we are going to put down 18 events. And one thing to keep in mind is that an educational event can span more than one workshop or time period. So for example, if your audience is the same every single time you go into this school, maybe you go to the same class 4 different times. That is still one training event because your audience is the same. But in this example, we have 8 school presentations. So that's 8 different audiences. Maybe you went to 8 different classrooms. That's why we have 18 in the education events provided category, which is number 19. But that's just something to keep in mind, that education events can be a single event or it can be a prolonged event over, there can be more than one frequency of it, but it is still the same audience. And similar to the training section, in number 20, we are asked to break apart our audience members, or our attendees, by who they are in the community. So for this example, we're breaking apart the 1,150 community members and 620 students and educators, and for a total of 1,770 people that were educated. In question 21, you're going to check off all of the topic areas that are relevant to the education events that you provided in the community and in the schools. And in question 22, you get to provide more information about those educational events. Section C3, Coordinated Community Response, or CCR. This is asking about the agencies that you are working with in the community. We all recognize that partnering with others is really important to be effective in this work. So the matrix on the form, on the left-hand side, you have a list of agencies and organizations that commonly turn up as your partners in this work. And so the next three columns are about the frequency with which you are giving and receiving referrals to and from these agencies. So think about how often you are giving or receiving referrals to programs like battery intervention programs, child protective services, court, deaf organizations, disability organizations, and so on down the list. Your options of frequency are daily, weekly, or monthly. That's how often you give or receive referrals between your agency and their agency. The next set of columns under meetings is about how often you are meeting with these organizations, for example, on a task force or a regularly scheduled meeting where you're meeting with your community partners. And again, they're asking for the frequency of those meetings, whether weekly, monthly, or quarterly. And then in the final column, it's asking whether or not you have a memorandum of understanding with this community partner. Is this an MOU partner or not? You just check the box, yes or no. Question 24 gives you an opportunity to say more information about your CCR activities and the effectiveness of it. Moving along to the next section, policies. You'd report on protocols and policies that you have developed or significantly revised during this reporting period. If it's still in the development or revision phase, hold off on reporting it until next time when it's actually finished. But if it is completed and substantially revised, meaning that you spent a significant chunk of staff time or resources in revising it, not just minor changes, but significant changes, then you can report it here, all of the topics of the policies and protocols that you are developing, revising, or implementing. More information about those can go in question 26. And then in our next section, C5, products, there's a list of various types of products that you might be creating with your grant funds: brochures, manuals, newsletters, posters, public service announcements, training curricula, training materials, videos, websites, or other. So if you have developed or significantly revised a product and gotten it approved by OVW in this period, you would want to fill out the number of products that you have developed or revised and had approved in this period. Then the topic and the title of that product in the next column over, and the audience that it's being intended for. If you haven't gotten around to distributing this product that you've developed yet, then you would leave the next column blank. You've just created the product, but you haven't had a chance to distribute it yet. That's fine. Conversely, you may have a product that you developed in a prior period, but is only just now being distributed, or you continuously distribute it over time, but it wasn't created during this reporting period. In that case, you would leave the first column about number developed or revised blank, and you would just tell us how many were used or distributed. One thing to note about used or distributed, this is not the number of products that you printed. Maybe you printed 1,000 brochures, but you distributed 100 of them. You would just report the 100 that were distributed. Hang on to the remaining 900. If you distribute them next time, then report them then. But this is just for what was actually created or distributed during this period. If you develop something in another language, then tell us about that in the final column. The next section for public awareness, this relates to your grant-funded activities in community organizing, perhaps media campaigns, educational exhibits, or productions. So if you were using grant funds for public awareness activities of those kind, then you would check the boxes in each category and you would divide it out by the type of victimization that it is directed towards. The next section, systems improvement. This may be related to activities that you are spending grant funds on program evaluation, safety audits, interpretation or translation of materials or documents, equipment, things like that. If you are using funds for these kinds of things, then you would check the appropriate box in the categories. At this point, we're going to move into the victim services section, which is where we'll spend the bulk of this training. All of the data that is requested in Section D, this is congressionally mandated. Congress wants to know how many victims and survivors were seeking services at your organization and how many could or could not be served. So the information that you're providing in this section is representing only those victims and survivors that were served or partially served by these grant programs. So all of this is capturing your grant-funded work with victims and survivors. So in question 32, the form is asking you to break apart all of the victims and survivors who came to your agency based on whether they were served, partially served, or not served, and by their presenting victimization, either sexual assault, domestic violence, dating violence, or stalking. So first we're going to think about served, partially served, or not served. What does that mean? First, we need to consider whether or not a victim or survivor is requesting or accepting grant-funded services. This is the primary thing that we're thinking about before we report somebody in question 32. Are they requesting or accepting services? Are those services funded under your grant, and are they a primary victim of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking? There is a place to report secondary victims in question 33, and we'll get to that a little bit later. But for right now, we're just thinking about who is served, partially served, and not served, and these are all primary victims of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking. So if somebody is served in question 32, that means they requested grant-funded services, and you were able to provide all of those services. If somebody was partially served, that means they were requesting grant-funded services, but because of programmatic issues such as those listed in question 34, there's a list of reasons that you may have partially served or not served somebody, you were not able to provide all of the services that were requested. If somebody was not served, that means that your program could not provide any of the services that they were requesting and which were grant-funded due to programmatic issues. So before we move on, I just want to hang out here a little for a moment and talk about partially served and not served. We find that grantees are often worried about reporting victims as partially served or not served because they fear that if they do report partially served or not served victims and survivors, it will appear that they are not meeting their goals and objectives, or it's going to shed a negative light on their program. However, by reporting victims partially served and not served, grantees are actually helping OVW and decision makers to understand the scope and burden of violence that stretches far beyond what VAWA is able to fund. OVW knows that VAWA funding is not enough to support every victim who requests services from grantees. So we want to encourage you to carefully track and report using both qualitative and quantitative data to highlight instances of partial or non-service. Narrative data can highlight long waiting lists for services, full emergency shelters, or a program's inability to support victims on family court days. Your more detailed data can help show the great need for services that exist. So I also want to spend a little bit of time thinking about who is not appearing on this form, and that would be people who are requesting services that are not funded under this grant. If somebody's requesting non-grant funded services, then they might be reported somewhere, but it's not on this form. Also, if you are offering grant-funded services based on a need that you perceive, but they are not accepting those services, then they are also not counted. So you might see a need and offer your services, which are grant-funded, but they are rejecting those services. They do not get counted here. So the temptation would be to put those kinds these two examples of people in the not served category, but really they shouldn't appear in this question at all because they're not accepting or requesting grant-funded services. Also, if they're not a primary victim of sexual assault, domestic violence, dating violence, or stalking, they don't go in this section. They only go in question 33, but the rest of the section is only for primary victims. Question 32 is also looking for an unduplicated count of victims and survivors. So we understand that victims and survivors may receive service over long periods of time, and they may come back at various times to receive more and different services. So every reporting period that you are serving a client, they can appear on that progress report, but they don't appear more than once on that progress report in question 32. So we also recognize that somebody may have multiple victimizations, and so you want to put them in more than one column in question 32, but we are looking for an unduplicated count of victims, so we ask that you identify their presenting victimization rather than all of their victimizations. There will be a time later on in this section to capture multiple victimizations or multiple offenders, but in question 32, we ask that you identify the presenting victimization that brought them through your door, and this may be a matter of discretion. There's no right or wrong answer here, but just pick one victimization and categorize them whether they were served, partially served, or not served, and in the category of victimization that most closely represents what brought them to your agency. So one example here might be an example, a victim's estranged intimate partner who had a history of very controlling behavior came to her apartment and sexually assaulted her. She came to your agency looking for help with a protection order. You could report this victim as either domestic violence, dating violence, or sexual assault, but you have to choose only one. The sexual assault category might be more appropriate in this instance because even though she has experienced domestic violence over time and she also has that victimization in her history, it was the sexual assault that really prompted her to seek your service. But again, there's no right or wrong answer, but that's probably how I would report that situation. So now we're going to turn to our example on our reporting form, and we're going to go through what it means to be served, partially served, or not served. So in this example, a victim of domestic violence calls your program looking for crisis intervention and group support. Both of these services are funded under your CISP Underserved grant, and you provide crisis intervention and she attends a support group. So in this case, she is asking for 2 grant-funded services, and she's receiving both of them. So she appears as served under the domestic violence, dating violence column in question 32. Next, your program offers crisis intervention and transportation under your CISP or Underserved grant. A victim of domestic violence asks for these 2 services, but your program can only provide crisis intervention because the advocate is busy and unable to provide transportation. In this case, the victim received some but not all of the services that were funded under your grant. So we're going to report her as partially served under domestic violence, dating violence in question 32. In question 34, the reason for partial service that we are going to capture for her is going to be that your program was unable to provide service due to limited resources or priority setting. And this is a very comprehensive list of reasons that somebody might be partially served or not served. And so before you put a reason in the other category here, really carefully read through this list and see if the situation that you were describing fits into any of these categories. In this case, it would be limited resources or priority setting. Our next example is a woman who is sexually assaulted and a police officer responds to that incident, and they call your hotline on behalf of the victim asking if an advocate will accompany her to the hospital during her exam. But there's no advocate available to do this. And so this is a service that you're funded to provide under your CISP or Underserved grant. However, you're not able to do so, again, for the same reason as prior, that your program was unable to provide the service due to limited resources or priority setting. So in question 32, you're going to put her down as sexual assault, not served. Now we're just going to spend a quick minute on question 33 for secondary victims. This is the only place in victim services where you get to report on secondary victims, except in transitional housing and emergency shelter where children or secondary victims can also appear accompanying primary victims. So secondary victims might be children, siblings, spouses, intimate partners, parents, grandparents, and anybody else, an affected relative who is affected by the violence against your primary victim. And so the victims in question 33 do not necessarily need to be tied to a specific victim that you have reported in question 32. So for example, there may be somebody who is who is the primary victim of sexual assault, and her mom comes to your agency for counseling, but the actual primary victim is not ready for your services yet, and so she is not receiving services yet, but the mother is receiving counseling. And so the mother goes in question 33 as a secondary victim of sexual assault. And nowhere in question 32 do we actually see the daughter, the primary victim, yet the mother is still recorded in question 33. So there doesn't need to be a direct link between victims in 32 and the victims in 33. So that's just a little bit about reporting secondary victims. But now I'm just going to move forward into the rest of the victim services section, and from here on out we are only thinking about the primary victims who were served or partially served. We've already wrapped up the partial service and the not service in question 34, so now we're just thinking about the services that you did give to those who were served or partially served. So the demographics that are asked for on this form, generally they need to total the total amount of victims and survivors who were served or partially served in question 32. So the first exception being in race and ethnicity. Somebody may report more than one race or ethnicity. So the total here can be more than the total number of victims who were served and partially served in question 32. Next, we have gender. And here, the total for gender does need to equal the total number of victims served and partially served in question 32. So for victims and survivors who are coming to your agency and don't fit into the provided categories for gender, male, female, or unknown, you can use the category that most closely fits the gender that they identify with. And if you don't know, then you can use the unknown category. Again, in age, you want to report the age ranges of the victims that are coming to your agency. And if you don't know, there's an unknown category, but the total for age does need to equal the total victims and survivors who were served and partially served in question 32. For other demographics, you would report on this to the best of your knowledge as you serve this person, whether they have disabilities, whether they are deaf or hard of hearing, whether they have limited English proficiency, whether they are immigrants, refugees, or asylum seekers, or whether they live in rural areas. Again, you're reporting to the best of your knowledge. That doesn't necessarily need to be data that you collect fastidiously in intake. In question 36, this is where we get to capture multiple victimizations because we have a list of relationships between the victim and offender. And so if somebody has experienced multiple forms of violence or from multiple offenders, this is where you get to capture that. So somebody that is their primary victimization is domestic violence in question 32, you may also report that they are also a victim of sexual assault. Maybe it's by the same offender, maybe by a different offender. In question 37, this is where you would report the types of services that you are providing to victims. And here again, remember that we are looking for an unduplicated count of individual survivors. And so in each category of service, we're not looking for the frequency with which you provided that service to your clients. We're looking for the number of individuals who received that service. For example, somebody may have received counseling on a weekly basis for all 6 months. But you're not going to report that frequency. You're just going to report that person who's receiving the counseling once in the counseling category. So, and then you would report all of the services that you have provided that person so that person can appear in every single category if they're receiving all of these services. In question 37B, immigration matters, you would report all of the immigration matters that you are assisting your clients with. For shelter services, this is the only other place where secondary victims can go. So the first column is for primary victims and survivors that are receiving emergency shelter or transitional housing. And the next column over is for family members that might be accompanying them in those shelters. And then the total number of bed nights is for everybody. For example, if you have one victim and her 2 children who are staying in emergency shelter and they stay for a month, you have 3 people staying for 30 days, so that's 90 bed nights. Question 38 asks for hotline calls from victims and survivors and the total number of hotline calls, and these can also be calls for information or referrals. You might have noticed in question 37 that information and referral is not considered a service, but you can record that here for all of the information and referrals that you gave to people that you may not have provided them a service as it relates to question 37, but you did give them information and referrals, and you can record that here in question 38. And we also ask that you report the languages that you are answering these calls in or serving victims and survivors in. List out the languages. Don't just tell us the number of languages that you are using at your organization to serve people, but list out the actual languages, as we do like to report on all of the languages that are being used by grantees in these programs. Next, there is also a place for walk-in information referrals and web-based information referrals. And so again, there's a column for requests for information referral, web-based or walk-in for victims and survivors, and then the total request for information. Question 39 is a place for outreach to victims and survivors. So these outreaches to victims and survivors may not have necessarily resulted in them receiving services from your organization, but you reached out to them. So here you get to count all of those outreaches, whether they resulted in service or not. So that might mean 30 unsolicited letters to victims and survivors, and maybe only 2 of those victims came to you for services as a result of those letters, so you get to record all 30 letters outreaches here. It may also be that a police officer asks you to accompany a victim to their exam, but when you get there to accompany them, the victim refuses the service. So you made an outreach, and it didn't necessarily result in service, but that was an outreach to a victim or survivor, and it can be recorded here in question 39, since it can't go in question 32 as somebody that was not served, since that person was refusing the service. Question 40 asks about protection orders. So if your grant-funded staff is assisting victims and survivors in obtaining protection orders, we ask that you break those apart by the presenting victimization. That's not saying that the protection order itself is victimization specific, but we ask that you categorize them based on the victimization or the primary victimization of the survivor that you're assisting, and then whether it was a temporary order or final order, whether it was requested or whether it was granted. Finally, in question 41, you have the opportunity to give additional information about all of the information that you provided in the victim services section. So here you can talk about survivor stories, you can talk about challenges, you can talk about successes, whatever helps us to paint a picture or tell a story behind the data. So the narrative really helps us to flesh out the numbers. So I encourage you to use this box. Last on the form, we're going to talk about narrative. So the narrative portion is your opportunity to communicate with OVW and with policymakers, and often this narrative winds up in our reports to Congress. And so we ask that you really be candid with stories about what's going on in your organization or in your community, the needs that you are seeing, and what you are able to do as a result of having these grant funds. So question 42 asks about your goals and objectives and your status on them. So this question is mostly for your program manager at OVW to do grant monitoring. So that's just your status update right there. In question 43, it's asking about which of your services are really specifically tailored to reach the culturally specific populations that you're serving. So that's where you get to talk about culturally specific services. Questions 44 and 45 are kind of like both sides of one coin. And so in question 44, we're looking at the remaining area of need. And this can be like a big picture. This does not have to be related to the narrow scope of your grant activities and what you're funded to do and who you're funded to serve. But this can be a bigger picture about the need that you see in your population or your community and what is not being met. Like what are the further needs and the bigger scope of violence that so far programs and funds have not been able to assuage. Question 45 then is the flip side of that question. What has your funding allowed you to do? What have you been able to do that you could not have done without this funding? So this is about meeting the need that you wouldn't have been able to meet without the funds. Questions 46 and 47 are more additional optional information. So 46 is basically spillover for the effectiveness of this grant program, and so any more that you couldn't fit in question 45, put it here. In question 47, this is really for us here at VAWA NEI to understand the data that you're reporting. So if something isn't working on the form, if there's data that you know that we're not going to understand and you just want to preempt our questions about it and you want to tell us about it right here, put that in question 47. We use this question to help us understand anything that looks funny on the form. So that brings us to the end of the narrative section. So finally, you're going to go to the last page of the report. Once you've completed filling in all of your information, go to the last page and click Validate. You are going to get one of 3 messages. The first message that you might get is a big red X. That means that something on the form is not working correctly. And you need to click Yes and go back to whatever section of the form it's telling you is incorrect or incomplete. And so once you have resolved that issue or completed whatever section was not completed, then you can come back and click Validate again. Then you may get a soft warning, which is the yellow exclamation point. This is not necessarily an error, but it is telling you that something on the form doesn't look quite right, and you may want to go back and check it out. So click Yes, go back and take a look and see if you wanted to correct or complete any data there. But if it's already what you meant to report, then come back down and click Validate again, and hopefully you will get that final message saying you have successfully validated this form and you are ready to submit. At that point, you can go into GMS and submit this form, and you are done. So, to wrap this training up, I just want to draw your attention to some of the resources available to you on our website. Those would be sample progress reporting forms like the one that you see on the right side of this screen. These cannot be uploaded into GMS. They are only for your use as tools. You can take a look at them, practice with them, and so that you know all of the data that you need to be collecting throughout the period because you're going to be asked to report on it at the end of the period. You will also find training dates and training materials on our website. You can attend a live webinar with us twice a year. You will also find reports to Congress on our website, the most recent of which is the 2016 report to Congress, and you can take a look at the effectiveness section of this report, which talks a lot about the scope and burden of violence and how the Violence Against Women Act is addressing that. And then you can look at the program-specific chapters in the report that talks about what each grant program, including the culturally specific grant program and the Underserved program, have done about these needs and what they have done in their communities and for victims and survivors. You will also find summary data reports, which are quick snapshots of the data that has been reported by all of the grantees, program-specific, for every 6-month period. And to conclude, I just want to leave our contact information with you so that you will reach out to us with any questions that you might have. Please use us as a resource and a technical assistance provider. You can call us or email us, and we will get back to you, and we will try to walk you through or help you in your process of reporting your data. You can also reach out to your program specialist at OVW. And if you are having any technical difficulties with the form or with GMS or with getting into GMS, you want to reach directly out to GMS support, and their phone number and their email are right here for you. Thank you so much for sitting through this training with us, and we look forward to working with you.